At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Since they first evolved 350 million years ago, trees have been battling with the elements, weathering storms, regenerating over and over after being eaten, blown over, nibbled and bashed about. They are nature's great survivors. And the natural damage they have learned to cope with has created a mini-universe of niche habitats created through disturbance, supporting a kingdom of unusual invertebrates, hole-nesting birds, bats, fungi, and other unknown creatures amongst the rarest animals in Europe. My guest today, Vikki Bengtsson, has spent her life studying the special ecology of our oldest and gnarliest trees. She was an Ancient Tree Forum founder, and she continues to push new boundaries in terms of our knowledge and understanding about where trees have come from, their incredible capacity for resilience, and the myriad of life that they support, where we allow them to. I hope you enjoy our chat. Hello there, Vikki. Thanks for joining me for a chat from Sweden today. How's the weather there today?
It's actually remarkably mild for the time of year, so I'm appreciating that, and we don't have any snow.
Now, you may not realise this, but in my professional journey with trees, particularly understanding veteran trees, you have long been what I see as a kind of tree auntie that I look up to in the industry. Sorry to embarrass you. But yeah.
And you have.
So yeah, this is a special interview for me, and we first met more than a decade ago at Hatfield Forest when I was cutting my teeth on the subject of veteran tree management, and we've since bumped into each other quite a few times through the Ancient Tree Forum. But yeah, back in those days, I was probably just, another one of many students in your class. But the learning and the questions you've given me to take into my work have led a lifelong journey, basically. So I can't wait to ask you a few questions, actually. And I probably haven't put some of these your way until now. But the first one of those questions is, what exactly do trees mean to you?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you. That feels like such an honour and a privilege to hear you say that. And if that helped you on your journey with trees, then that is fabulous. So thank you. Yeah, my journey with trees, actually, I'm not one of these, child prodigies who was out in nature as a kid, really. I grew up in the centre of Edinburgh. I used to jump over a wall into Arthur Seat, if anybody knows Edinburgh, but the countryside wasn't really a huge part of my life as a child. My dad climbed all the hills in Scotland, and sometimes I went along for the ride, but it was much less about trees and much more about hills. But when I went to university, my project that I did at university was looking at hedgerows and old trees in the stomping grounds of Oliver Rackham. And that's really where I guess I realised how interesting it was, the combination of how we've managed the land, people's relationships with trees, and how that's influenced our landscape. I had a fantastic university lecturer who took us out as students to see how people worked in the countryside. And that was a real revelation that you could have a job doing this, that you could work with nature conservation. And there were loads of different people that did different jobs with nature conservation. So I have to say that it's probably him that was the big inspiration for me in suddenly finding, actually, I really fancy working with this. This is up my street, I suppose. I was going to be a biochemist. So that's where it started when I was a student. And actually, as I said, getting into a course which was more focused on ecology and nature conservation was just a bit of luck, really, I think.
Yeah.
And obviously I felt like that's the route I want to go. And then I got lucky, got my first job, and that was really where it carried on.
Well, thank goodness it did. So do you remember like the first old tree, maybe in that hedgerow project or somewhere else that, left an impression on you?
I suppose maybe not an individual tree, but it was pollards that really got me excited. And that's continued to get me excited really throughout my career. And in fact, I've often called myself, and other people have called me, a pollard nerd. But the shapes of those trees, the history that they tell you about because of their shapes is really what struck me at that time. And I was looking at how landscape had changed and the loss of hedgerows and those trees. But it was primarily the hedgerows that was the project, but it was the trees that caught my attention, I suppose.
And pollards are like living archaeology, aren't they?
They really are. And they tell you so much. We've got fabulous old maps, both, here in Sweden and in the UK, but just another overlay, I suppose, of that historical information. How they've grown is entrenched in how they look. And that's interesting. And I guess I was then really lucky. My first job after university was at Burnham Beeches. And I have an incredibly vivid memory of my first day at work, which was in the autumn, driving to work, and it was raining beech leaves. And the fabulous old pollarded beech trees at Burnham Beeches cemented, I think, my relationship with old trees. And I worked with Helen Reid, who was my idol and continued to be, someone that I work with very, very closely and have done over all of those 30 years. So that was definitely a real special moment for me in my career, definitely.
So speaking to Ted Green and others, this term treecologist comes up, and I've heard it in a few of the Arb Association webinars that we need more treecologists, and I definitely think of you when I hear that term. So what's a treecologist, if I've got that right?
Well, I guess for me at least, it's looking at the tree both as an individual but also as part of a landscape, that it's thinking about how it fits, where it's come from, the whole ecosystem that you find in one individual tree, but how that is such a part of something bigger as well. And that maybe is the bigger difference between how an arborist might look at trees, because they tend to look at individuals. I'm always looking at individuals, but I'm thinking about the bigger picture. I guess that's where I would see tree ecology coming in. And I know that Ted's very keen on the whole idea of it. And I think it's probably also one of the things that was pretty foundational in the Ancient Tree Forum. It was bringing together people from different walks of life and experiences and mixing us all up, which meant that I think all of us took, 2 or 3 decades leaps forward in our knowledge and understanding by sharing our different experiences and knowledge from different walks of life. And I guess for me, that's what tree ecology is about. And it's one of the things that fascinates me about old trees too, is just the ecology, the evolution, where they've come from, all the species that live on them, all the different nooks and crannies that are home to all sorts of things, that many of which we don't even know about yet.
It's a really interesting point, that one. And I think a lot of traditional arboricultural training teaches people to look at the individual tree, and it can sometimes be a leap or a different way to learn, to think about how that tree might also be connected to a wider web or network of other living things. But certainly in the oldest trees, it's almost like the closer we look, the more obvious it becomes how deeply entwined they are with their surroundings and their origins. And I wonder if we might be able to go on a little bit of a virtual journey around an ultimate ancient tree. And through your eyes as a tree ecologist, what are the different parts of the tree we might investigate, and what kind of things might we find there? So what tree are we going to look at, Vikki?
Oh, well, it'd have to be a pollard, wouldn't it?
100%.
Yeah, 100%. And just last week, somebody asked me, what my favorite tree species was. And I find that really difficult to answer, because I think for me, all old trees are interesting. It doesn't really matter what species they are. But if you push me, it's either a field maple or an ash. And I think when it comes to the features I suppose it would be the ash. So I've got in my mind, I've got an old ash pollard at Hatfield Forest where I used to work. And if you go on a virtual tour, you kind of have to start under your feet, but most of that's invisible to us. And there's a whole root system there that we just don't know really what's going on, and a whole life happening underground that is, beyond most of our comprehension. And then you come up through the trunk, and the trunk's doing all sorts of things. There'll be small holes, there'll be water pockets, there'll be bits of decay, and who knows, you might find an old nest that's there. You might find some egg shells from birds that have left it. You might even find a stash of nuts from some small mammals, bat droppings. And then you move up into the crown and the bark changes, and the light that comes through from the leaves change, and what's growing on the bark will change as well. So I suppose in a way, when I think about old trees and I try and explain why I think they're so special, I think about it like a block of flats that, people that live on the top floor with a south facing balcony, and there are people that prefer the ground floor, that they can go out straight out into the garden. And I think that's how I see an old tree. It's got all of these different sorts of flats, and people move in and out, and some live there a long time, others move, quickly or often. Others like it a bit more, hot and sunny up on the top, and others prefer it with the evening sun or the morning sun. And I think that's how I see an old tree, that they've kind of got a number of species living in them compared to the space that they take up. And that's sort of like a block of flats. We've built upwards, so we've got more people living in it than if you just had a single house.
Yeah, and I've got a question linked to this then. So knowing the depth of experience you've got with ancient and veteran trees and all the different things that might live in those flats or apartments that you spoke about, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on like the amount of discoveries that you must have made personally in, I'm sure, learning from others, but also through what you've seen as well? What a journey you must have been on.
Yeah, and I think the more I know, the less I understand. These amazing stories. Again, just last week, I looked at a tree with Helen, and there was some fabulous big exit holes from a beetle. And then there was these white threads coming out from it. So it looked like a kind of almost a sort of crown around the outside of the hole. Turns out it's a spider that moves in to the hole that the beetles come out of the tree and creates these threads around the outside, and it sits on the inside, and anything that vibrates those little threads around the outside, it jumps out and snatches it. And it was just like, wow, these connections that you think about in a tree, that you pull a bell string here and something rings a long way off. That's for me what ecology is all about. You don't know what connections there are. And one of the things I suppose I've learned most about is holes in trees, and just how many different species make use of those in space and time, and that just how incredibly valuable they are to a whole host of wildlife. And that for me is a bit of a wow moment, that we put up bird boxes all over the place, and they're a very superficial construction in comparison with a genuine hole in a living tree, which changes over time, and both its inhabitants and its succession over time. That's probably the thing that I've learned the most about, and also still fascinates me.
It's kind of like an inverted way of looking at trees in terms of many of the more general kind of views of what a tree is or does for living things, because you're talking about the voids in the tree, basically, that are still a part of it.
It's true, actually. It's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, but those voids, as you've kind of shown through your career, and as others have too, they seem to go on forever in a way, in that, yeah, we can't seem to work them out, but they certainly are a really important component of our ecology. And that links us actually to the work I know you've done around what's called veteranization or habitat pruning, where actually willfully and I would say
Sounds good.
skillfully, certainly with an informed rationale behind it, you have led some research into techniques to essentially damage or simulate conditions close to the natural kinds of damage that would always have been part of a tree's life since day dot, and something they have adapted to cope with, but that then has created niches for wildlife. Maybe you want to build on that intro I've just tried to give there.
Yeah, I guess it's about, mimicking nature and trying to create these precious habitats that develop in old trees a bit more quickly in younger trees. I think I would almost call it like first aid for old tree biodiversity. And where, in my mind, the thought processes came where we're seeing so many losses of these old trees and they're fragmented in our landscape. Virtually everywhere you travel in Europe, that's the case. Maybe not in the Iberian Peninsula and parts of Romania, but otherwise, there are very few places where you've got, say, more than 1,000 old trees left. I can probably count those on my hands, and certainly in Northern Europe. And that it just felt to me like if we do nothing, we know what's going to happen. That the more trees we lose, there's climate change, there's tree diseases. Whereas it felt like we've got trees, younger trees that have grown up maybe since grazing has been stopped, that are shading some of our old trees that we actually want to remove. So it felt to me like a bit of a no-brainer to, chop the tops off instead of felling them, because once they're felled, they've gone. Whereas if you can somehow keep them alive, then maybe they will produce at least some elements of what we would otherwise find in an old trees. They're never going to be a replacement because actually, there's such complex things that we don't really know all the processes going on. But it seemed to me like a bit of a no-brainer that we had nothing to lose, actually, because these trees would probably in many cases otherwise have been removed. And that was also in the early days when I was a bit unsure whether it would actually work or not. And I think now we have much more confidence that at least some of these techniques definitely do lead to favouring some of the species that would live in old trees as well. But I guess it's, it's a poor imitation, but it still feels like it's a worthwhile complement in our toolbox to help us in nature conservation and deal with some of these major, major challenges that we're facing with climate change, loss of trees because of, overzealous safety issues, or, ash dieback and other tree diseases that have had an impact. I think it just feels like, let's have this as another tool in our toolbox. It's not right everywhere, definitely not, but that we have it there, I think is worthwhile. And, I've been doing this, I guess, at least on the back of a fag packet since the late 1990s. And really, the research project that I'm involved in, we started in 2012, and it's actually really starting to get interesting now, 13 years down the line. And that's the downside with working with trees. Everything takes such a long time. But equally, it's been very exciting to see some of the results that we didn't expect, as well as some of the results that we hoped for.
Yeah, and it's not damaging old trees, it's actually damaging younger trees that should have the vitality to cope with those wounds and create some interesting features and habitats that will hopefully survive for a long time after that.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important. I would never, ever, ever want that to be done on any of our old trees. Even actually, I would say trees that might give you a hint of potentially being vaguely interesting in the future. I mean, I only ever would advocate this kind of work on trees that I would describe as being very boring. So they really have nothing happening, nothing going on. Probably your perfect forestry tree. Apologies, foresters. They're the kind of perfect options. And also trees that otherwise would have to be removed, as I said, because they're shading out the old trees. So definitely not on our old trees. And that's our absolute priority. I think that's often the case. I've had a lot of criticism about these ideas over the years. And I think that for me, it's really clear that our absolute number one objective is to look after the old trees we've got. But that doesn't mean we have to exclude other things as well. We plant trees all over the place. Many of those will never reach maturity, but it is amazing to see how these trees cope. We've had very few trees that have died despite, carving big holes out of the trunks and chopping the tops off. Really very few that have died. Quite the opposite. They've put on loads of growth.
Yeah, just some of the techniques that I've seen through this type of work in those trials are holes drilled into trees to replicate woodpecker holes that then later might become cavities that bats might live in. And then we've got things like simulating mammal damage, like horses rubbing up against the trunks of trees and wearing away the bark and the cambium layer, right through to more extreme things like using fungi in trees. But yeah, all with the goal of trying to create sustainable habitats in the long term for super rare species that will otherwise go extinct. And I've been thinking a lot recently about human beings' relationships with trees, actually, and us as kind of keystone species in a way where we're not being overly destructive. But certainly over human history, we have had a very special relationship with trees, but a lot of that has been us, for whatever means, abusing trees, actually. So whether that was pollards, where we cut them above the heads of the livestock so they wouldn't graze off the new shoots, and we used that as a sustainable resource for building materials and other resources, or even in the case of, say, an apple tree, where, we're cyclically cutting those trees on a rotation to produce fruit. And again, coppicing being another one where in a whole woodland setting that allows light in and where things are sustainable, we have enhanced habitats. And so that was a really special relationship that lasted for thousands of years. But now I think this type of work where we largely, I guess, through the biodiversity crisis that we're in, have to view what we're trying to look after in largely an intellectual sense. It's a way of maintaining a connection with trees, a practical one, providing actual habitats for super rare stuff. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think pollarding is probably where I've had most of my inspiration, because we've been pollarding trees for like 6,000 years. And there's some really good evidence that shows when we pollard trees on a regular basis, they get hollow more quickly. And quite often we see more of these kind of niches and cavities and decay and hollows in pollards because they've got these, strange and weird and wonderful shapes. So I do think that we've been damaging trees and using trees as working trees. I think Ted Green coined that phrase, and I think it's a really good phrase because it is a relationship that we've had with trees because we've needed it. In Scandinavia, the leaf fodder was incredibly important for people. And where we see these populations of old pollards, we also see very high biodiversity. So I think when people often say to me, well, you're damaging trees, I kind of counter that if I'm feeling a bit cocky and say, well, I think we've been doing it for 6,000 years, either coppicing or pollarding. It's just, under a different name. And I think that makes people think, that actually, yeah, maybe true. Trees can cope with a lot. Beavers, eat them and they grow back, and other animals eat them. I think that's been their evolutionary context. That's been how trees have developed. All of these different survival strategies that we see and admire have been because probably not so much humans, because I think, we've not been around long enough, but certainly things that eat them in different ways. That's why they produce new shoots. That's why they, can have got thick bark. That's why they have all these different features that we recognize and why they can survive so long, I think. So that we humans have probably just taken advantage of that ability and made use of that for our own needs. But as a byproduct, many of these landscapes with old pollards are really high in biodiversity as well. So I think there's a connection there in my mind, definitely.
Thanks, Vikki. It was important to me to just spend a bit of time to go into that, actually, because it is a controversial practice. I get it, and I get the rationale, and I also understand that it's highly skilled and specialist work as well. But yeah, it's become quite topical lately. But yeah, I guess if we go back to kind of the core principles of veteran tree management, often we start with the question, can we do nothing here? And actually that always guides our practice, doesn't it? And we'd only be creating these other artificially created habitats where the answer to that question is no, we can't do nothing. But yeah, just thinking about the resilience factor of trees that we've sort of briefly touched on there, and definitely in the case of pollards, which are dependent on those kind of evolutionary hacks in terms of regenerating, something that your work around the VetCert standard and the teaching of that, which I'm proud to say I'm a trainer of, has pointed to this idea that trees, in theory at least, could live on indefinitely. And I suppose a really good example of this might be that tree in North America, which is called Pando. They can't even decide how old it is. It could be 12,000 years, or I think it's 80,000 or something. But in short, it's like cloned itself 40,000 times over, and it's all the same genetic tissue. That's at one end of a scale, but actually, even an individual tree, many of them have this capacity to live on and respond to change in the environment if the conditions are right. And I'm sure you can explain this better than me. Maybe you could just put a little bit of science behind that concept for me.
Well, I guess it's partly to do with the differences between plants and animals, or trees in particular, but that we, as human beings, as animals, our cells eventually degrade. So we no longer produce new cells in the same way, which means, if you look at a 10-year-old child, you know pretty much where they are in their development, just as well as a 55-year-old woman. You kind of know where we are on the scale of things, but that's much, much more difficult with trees because they can, as you say, have these evolutionary life hacks that mean they can regenerate. And that's the crucial factor. They have this, what we call meristem, which is like the holy grail of regeneration. And it means that theoretically, as you say, they can produce shoots, new roots, new leaves from any part of a living meristem. And I think this is one of the things that I find most fascinating too. And I really try to encourage people to think about when they're managing trees and thinking about trees, that capacity is there. It's often, what happens in the environment that stops that. Plus, of course, there are different life strategies. We have some trees that are the live fast, die young variants, like our birch trees, and then the pine and the oak that are more like the blue whale. They take a long time to develop and they grow quite old. But in contrast to the blue whale still has a relatively short life in comparison to one of our oak or pine trees that could be easily over 1,000 years. And I mean, once they get to that point, I kind of think, geez, who cares? They're really old. There's a tree in Scandinavia as well, which they're estimating 6,000 years, but it's like a wee bush. It's a spruce tree that's about 0.5 meter tall. It's the whole root system that's the ancient part, whereas, as you say, it's cloned itself and regenerated. So the meristem is the crucial part that can regenerate into all sorts of. It would be like if, we chopped off our arm, the shoulder could produce another 5 arms. Well, that just doesn't happen with us. We can't do that. That's the fundamental difference. I mean, there are others too, but I think that's enough to illustrate the point.
There's long been an aspiration of human beings to live forever or sustain eternal youth. And I think it's going to be quite a while before we get anywhere close to trees' capacity to do anything like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think as well, I mean, that makes me think about tree time, particularly, as I've been a site manager, you have too. It's quite easy that you want to do something. To sit on your hands is probably the hardest thing to do. But in so many cases when working with old trees, that's the absolute best thing you could do. Go away and think about it and come back, even if that's next week, next month, next year, that actually the timescales that these things work on, both landscapes and individuals, is just beyond our comprehension. In our working life, 50, 60 years? An oak tree's hardly out of puberty by that time. And that's a real concept that I think is very important. And with that, to me, is at least a theoretical idea that trees can, have eternal life. And they don't, of course, for all sorts of reasons, but it's this theoretical basis of thinking about their evolution as well and putting them in the context of that when we think about how we manage them. That's where the tree ecologist in me comes out, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the decisions around trees often come back to our own sort of routines around the 9 to 5, or, okay, I'm seeing this tree today, I need to make a decision by the end of today. But I don't know about you, Vikki, but often I come up with my most appropriate management normally a couple of days later, or sometime unexpected. I'll just sort of dwell on what should we do here. It's not usually the case. You can jump straight to, a surefire assumption that you can lean on.
I think that's actually absolutely true. And it's one of the things that we've had criticism about the vets, their exams, as a problem, that we give people trees to look at, that they have to think about management. And as people say, I'd often, go away and think about it for a few days. And that's great. Obviously, that's what we would want to encourage. But the practicality of running an exam means that that's not possible. But it's absolutely the case. And also, I think what we've tried to encourage people to do is also have a network of people, because I know for myself that I can, be wondering about, thinking about something, and just being able to pick up the phone and say, this is kind of niggling me, or I'm thinking about this, and what are your thoughts? And of course, you always want to see the trees or the landscape in which they're in, but sometimes you just need to bounce those ideas off with somebody and get a sense check, really, I think.
Yeah, and after a while, they might be someone that then lives in your head, and you're like, I think I'll ask this person, what would they think in this scenario?
But I think as well, that's maybe the other thing for me about trees, is that it has meant that I've met all sorts of interesting people and made some absolutely lifelong friends. And you wonder if old trees attract certain sort of people that have things in common. But when I see us all together, we're all really different. So I can't really see that that's the case. But there's definitely that draw, that attraction, the fascination, the curiosity, which has been the underlying thing that I think we all have in common.
Definitely.
There are no answers either, Tom, and I think maybe that's the other bit. I think I work with engineers sometimes, and they have really crystal clear answers to their questions. With all the things that I'm working with, when they ask me a question, I'm like, well, it's quite possible, or it could also be this, or maybe even this might be. And that for them is a bit of a head mess. But for me, that's probably why I'm still doing it and why it's still keeping me interested.
I think that definitely relates to this podcast, and how the main questions in it are open-ended for sure. It's like we've got a meristemic mind, maybe.
That would be interesting.
I wonder if we could just touch on kind of tree culture a bit, thinking about that wider network that you've come into contact with of all different kind of tree people. I'm curious about what it might be like in Scandinavia. It's somewhere I've never been, and I know that actually, there probably is a long-standing wood-centered culture there.
It has been really interesting and a fascinating experience to move to a different country and work in that country as well, because it makes you reflect back on your experience from where you come from and ask questions about things in the new country as well. I think that in its own right has been a really fabulous experience. And there's an awful lot in common, I think, certainly between Sweden and England in particular with regard to our history. In Sweden as well, there are deer parks. The aristocracy is still really evident here with the large estates and so on. So there's an awful lot in common in that respect in terms of the land use history. But one of the things that's interesting here is there was a law protecting oak up until the 1800s. So it was in the ownership of the king. And then, the law stopped, but people still kind of think oak is protected. And that's really interesting, I think. It's like 150 years ago or even 200 years ago, and people still think it's protected, which is great. But that's an interesting cultural difference. Then the other thing is the history, I think, of pollarding for leaf hay. That's a very strong history in Sweden to make use of the trees for winter fodder. That was very important for survival here. Only really in the north of Scotland would be an equivalent kind of climate here. So that's another big difference. Then I think forestry is massive, and it has a huge influence on the modern culture. I mean, everyone I know has a chainsaw. That's a kind of, it's one of those things that was a bit of a shock to me, I suppose, that it's like you've got a hammer, you also have a chainsaw. And it kind of means, I think, in my experience, I suppose, that trees are a renewable resource because forestry is so fundamental here and has a long, long history. And that's a bit problematic when it comes to managing the old trees, because there's still that kind of perception, I suppose, that they're just as renewable as a spruce tree. So, I mean, culturally, that's a more modern thing, I think, but definitely the connection with trees. Also, churchyards have trees, often a ring of trees around the edges. And there's all sorts of stories as to why. That's also a relatively modern phenomenon in the last couple of hundred years. So some people say it's to stop the smell of the dead bodies, and other people said it was about solace and peace and creating a kind of nicer environment where you could go and mourn your family and friends. I mean, and even recently, I was running a course in a town up near Stockholm, and the woman took me to a tree that was full of dummies. And it seemed like that was the parents, when they were trying to wean their kids off their dummies, went to the tree and hung the dummy up in the tree to give to the tree fairies. And that's a really modern phenomenon, but shows, I guess, a connection. And there seems to be lots of these trees around in Sweden as well that people use. So, I mean, that difference of being a forestry nation, I suppose, compared with a more agricultural nation, maybe, those have their impacts on how people manage trees and have a relationship with trees. And one of the things that I really appreciate here is that avenues are protected. All avenues are protected as a standard piece of legislation, which is pretty amazing. And we also have an action plan for, I like the term in Swedish, actually, if I were to translate it, trees worthy of protection. So it's not ancient or veteran or these words that we get in a muddle over. It's just a tree that's worthwhile protecting, which has a definition, but is kind of, old, hollow and large, to keep it simple. And I really like that name, I guess, because it seems to make it easier for people to get their heads around.
Is it Sweden where trees above 1 metre in diameter are also protected, or is that somewhere else?
No, it is. I mean, these trees worthy of protection, in fact, all of them have a measure of protection that fit the definition. It's not a strong legal protection, but it does mean that you're not allowed to fell them without first gaining permission for felling them. So there is definitely protection there. It is a fabulous, situation that we have here in comparison to many other countries.
Interesting. And is it Sweden that there's a tree where people pass children through the branches of it, maybe?
Yeah, and it was for toothache. I think actually it's a picture in the vet cert course. That's one of my photos where I forced my colleague through the hole in the tree just to show the point that it was meant to cure your toothache.
I wonder if they've been to the dentist since.
I don't know either.
So I'd like to just ask you about traveling the world and sort of seeing trees around and about. And I guess any particular stories that might jump to mind when you think about that human and tree relationship in different places. Have you got any memories of anything like that?
My favourite place to visit trees is Spain and the Basque Country. I mean, it's perfect. It's got good food, good wine, and fantastic trees, and wonderful biodiversity and fabulous people. So it's just, it ticks every box. But there's such a long history and a more recent history of the relationship between people and pollarding their trees. So for either charcoal or summer fodder as well, which is interesting. And they cut lots of different trees, but then they also cut trees in relation to the moon phase. And no one can really explain to us why that is, or, the reasons behind it. And there's lots of different theories, but they're very, very conscientious about that. So that's really interesting, I think. And I love the fact that there are still people alive that can remember how they cut the trees and have still got their axes at home, and kind of know what they did and how they managed those trees. It's my go-to place when I really feel like I want to get a good fix of old trees.
There's a strong heritage still alive there connected to trees then.
Absolutely. And also, the shipbuilding industry, the charcoal production. And I was in another part of Spain recently where they were managing the trees like fruit trees for acorn production for the Pata Negra pigs, where they're eating the acorns. And again, that silvopastoral situation is still alive and kicking in Spain in comparison to many other parts of Europe. And that's really, for me, a great place to visit, to get that sense of the connection between people, trees, and their animals.
I've got a couple more questions for you. First of all, I'd like you to explain what your hopes are for the future when it comes to veteran trees and their care.
Well, I hope that we can retain as many as possible, and that we really improve and increase our understanding of how precious they are. I read a fabulous book not long ago called The Tapestry of Life by a researcher called Anne Sverdrup Tugesson. She's a Norwegian, and she's got a fabulous way of describing that she loves old trees too. And she talks about life being a hammock that we're all resting in, and that we've been pulling out the threads, and the hammock lasts even with quite a lot of threads missing, but eventually will fall through. And I think in my mind, I hope that we carry on putting threads back rather than pulling threads out. And with regards to old trees, I guess they are what I would say is a real keystone of many of our most precious habitats. And I think, as I said before, they have so much biodiversity compared to the space they take up. It's a quick win, low-hanging fruit, certainly in our temperate regions, to look after them and revere them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'd really like to see some reconnections with working trees. And it's something that I've been thinking about and trying to encourage in different sorts of ways through projects, European projects and so on, look at ways in which we might produce wood fuel again from pollarding, ways in which we might leaf fodder again, and in countries like France, they've been quite successful in doing projects to create products from trees again. I'd really like to see that happen, because I think really, probably, realistically, maybe only then we'll see a return to a landscape with old trees if they have to work for a living. And maybe that's a sad reflection, but in a way, I think it's probably a realistic reflection and something that I would hope for the future, that we go back maybe to more of a silvopastoral, or at least a silvo relationship, so that we have trees that work, along roadsides. It's a no-brainer. People have to cut down trees and manage the bushes. It would be cheaper to pollard them instead. You'd have to do it less often, and we'd improve our long-term biodiversity maybe. So I think those are my two hopes, really.
Thanks, Vikki. And this tends to be my guest's favourite bit, actually, when I hand over to a final message and the soundbite. So, I'm curious to know what you're going to say for this bit. But before I hand over fully, just want to say a really big thank you. I've really, really enjoyed our chat. Thanks.
And thank you too, Tom. It's been very nice to chat to you. And also I've enjoyed working with you over the years as well. And I'm really glad that you're a trustee of the ATF too. I think it gives me real hope for the future, that we've got lots of people who are keen and interested and understand the heart of the organisation going forward.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. What's my soundbite? I guess, appreciate what amazing living sculptures these old trees are. We often admire man-made things more, or at least we value them more. But I think, for me at least, spending a little bit of time around a few old trees, we'd all benefit from. And probably it would help us move forward on biodiversity and ensuring that we can keep trees in the future.
Listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.